Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're looking at Chapter 19, Section 2, Mining and Railroading. And like you can see from the title, today our essential question, the thing that we're going to try to answer with this lesson is what impact did mining have on the development of the American West? And in the second half of today's lesson, we'll look at the impact that the railroads had on the development of the West. And since we're talking about wealth today, the picture that I used for the audio recordings is of Uncle Scrooge. So if you want to use the audio recordings, click below him. Otherwise, let us continue and take a look at our key terms for today. And our key terms for today are load, and this is a different version of load, not like the something that you carry, but this load is a rich vein of gold, silver, or some other precious metal. Vigilante, transcontinental, and subsidy. These are all things that we will talk about today in conjunction with mining and railroads. But first, a question, and it's going to seem like a really strange question for a history class. Is greed good? Now, we're looking at a picture of Michael Douglas as he was portrayed in the 1987 movie Wall Street, and he's famous for making a speech in that movie in which he said, greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. And this character, Gordon Gekko, embodies what some believe about what it takes for people to succeed. Now, why would I put a quote from a 1980s movie about insider trading on Wall Street at the beginning of a lesson about railroads and mining in the late 1800s? It seems weird, but I really do have a point. And it's because greed is really what drew thousands of people from all over the globe to the American West in hopes to strike it rich. And this first little video clip is going to be of this speech, so you can kind of get a little bit more of a context of what he's trying to say.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
And we're back. Now, in an earlier chapter, I believe it was chapter 13, we talked about the California Gold Rush of 1848, 1849. And during that gold rush, remember, we talked that thousands of men and some women rushed out to California after gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill outside San Francisco. Well, most of the people that moved to the West never got rich during the gold rush, but some stayed and stuck around and opened businesses, started farms, while others said, you know what, I failed at trying to strike it rich, so I'm going to go back home, back east. But when gold was discovered again, tens of thousands of prospectors once again rushed out to the American West. And it all started in 1859 when two prospectors struck gold in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And soon after that, another man named Henry Comstock showed up to where these men were prospecting and said, it's all well and good that you're prospecting here, but this is actually my land. And Comstock demanded to be made a partner, and eventually the gold strike became known as the Comstock Lode. And like I said, this is lode, L-O-D-E, which means a rich vein of gold, silver, or some other precious ore. So Comstock and his partners really complained because they're trying to mine the gold, but they complained about this very heavy blue sand that was mixed in with the gold, and it made the gold mining very difficult. But after this blue sand was examined, it was found to be loaded with silver. So what started out as a gold mine turned into one of the largest silver mines in the world. And this new rush, this new gold and silver rush, and the rush for these new valuable ores caused mines to pop up all over California, Nevada, Montana, Idaho, and even as far north as Alaska. And this map, I'm going to zoom in real quick so you can see Sutter's Mill and, oh, there's the Comstock Lode. Pretty close to each other, but you can see all of the different gold mining regions as well as the silver mining regions, and some of them are right next to each other, but some, like, there's a little bit of space in between. So because of this, because of finding these new gold and silver mines were popping up all over the West, but the miners would eventually need supplies, so towns would start to grow up close to the mines, and at first the towns would more or less start as a group of tents, but eventually wooden and more permanent buildings would be constructed to house restaurants, stores, banks, hotels, so on and so on. And the towns would be centered near the mine while the mine was successful. But once the mine was depleted, there was really no reason for the miners to stick around, so they would leave. And since the miners were the primary customers of these businesses, many of the businesses had to close up and move on. So the town would go from just a small group of tents to a boom town, which was a very successful, quickly constructed town, to a ghost town, or abandoned, in only a matter of just a few years. And some of these towns did survive after the close of the mines, but many of them just emptied out and, like I said, went from a boom town to a ghost town in just a matter of a few years.
In the late 1800s, with the Civil War over, the nation turned its attention to the western frontier. When gold and silver were discovered in many areas, mining became an important industry in the West. Each time a new gold or silver strike was found, miners flocked to the area. Mining camps full of miners seeking their fortunes sprang up almost overnight. At first, these camps were nothing more than tent cities, but they did not stay that way for long. When prospectors went, others followed. Merchants set up businesses selling the miners the tools, food, and clothing they needed. Soon, hotels, stores, and other wood-frame buildings appeared. Women joined the mining boom, too. They could make a good living by opening restaurants, washing clothes, or setting up boarding houses for the miners. These camps grew into boom towns. Sumter, Oregon, in the state's eastern goldfields, was one of these boom towns. Sumter's population peaked at 4,000 in 1903, after its mines produced just under $9 million. That would be more than $1 billion today. At its height, Sumter was a bustling community with electricity, a railroad, a hospital, 16 saloons, 5 hotels, and 2 banks. But success did not last forever in Sumter or in the other boom towns. Mining towns did not last long once all the ore had been removed from the nearby mines. When the gold was gone, the mines were shut, and miners moved away in search of riches elsewhere. With few customers, businesses failed, and the merchants left. Boom towns became ghost towns, their stores abandoned and their streets empty. Sumter suffered decades of neglect. Then in 1917, disaster struck. That year, a fire started at a hotel and 12 blocks burned down. The flames might have turned hope into ashes, but the residents of Sumter, Oregon fought back, though it took them many decades to once again find success. Today, Sumter is doing very well. Like some other ghost towns, it is now a thriving tourist area. During the mining boom, the Sumter Valley Railroad carried ore to the smelter from neighboring mines. Today, the restored railway carries tourists around its tracks. But the main attraction has always been the Sumter Valley Dredge. It moved millions of dollars worth of gold from the valley floor. Today, even though the famous dredge is no longer functional, tourists still come to see it in all its glory. In the late 1800s, gold and silver discoveries brought miners to the west and led to the development of boomtowns. Today, some of those towns are prospering by reliving the old days.
So these mines brought people to the area, brought miners to a new area. Towns started to pop up, and with towns and with people coming together and living together, problems can arise. So what do you think some of the problems could possibly arise from these miners all moving into a new area? Well, first, the miners need homes, so trees were cut down for that, and the miners and the mines polluted streams, polluted rivers, but what about the people that already lived there? What about the Native Americans? Didn't they live there first? Yes, they did. So there was the problem with moving into these areas where Native Americans didn't necessarily want these miners. And also, I mentioned that miners came from back east. Well, they also came from all over the world trying to fulfill their dreams, and these foreign miners faced discrimination and high taxes that weren't applied to other miners. So, like happened with the 1849 gold rush, most miners of this rush did not strike it rich. Most of the gold and the silver was very deep underground, and it required really expensive machinery to try and retrieve it. So large companies were really the only ones that could afford the machinery that it took, and so they would take over these mines and hire cheap labor to mine these lodes. And individual prospectors, like the one we're looking at here with his pack dog heading out to Alaska, were often replaced by machines and cheap labor. And we're actually looking at the town of Deadwood, South Dakota in about 1876. And as you can see, it even looks like it was just kind of built in a hurry. And because it was, and because of the people that were attracted to these areas, policing these mining towns became very difficult. Lawlessness and disorder often accompanied these rapidly growing and then dying towns. And most of the claims of disorder and lawlessness and people shooting their guns off nightly, a lot of this was exaggerated and sensationalized to make people back east see that, oh, this is the new frontier, and it's every man for himself out there. Like, yes, there were stories where these weren't always the nicest towns to be living in, but a lot of the claims of just like utter insanity were really, really exaggerated. But the towns were still dangerous places because of the reasons why people were there. For example, we're looking at Deadwood right now. About 2 years after it was founded, Deadwood, South Dakota had opened gambling halls, saloons, and houses of prostitution. So not exactly the nicest place to go. And Deadwood and other towns like it had reputations for lawlessness, so miners would hire vigilantes, or vigilantes are self-appointed officers of the law, to try and keep order. They weren't actual police officers, they weren't members of the military, they were just somebody that people said, I want you to try and clean up this town and try and enact your own forms of justice. They would track down outlaws and exact justice, which generally was without a trial. But why would these towns need to hire vigilantes? Didn't they have police forces? Or what about the U.S. government or the army? What about them? Well, a lot of these mines were located in areas that were still territories. They hadn't become full states yet. So they needed the vigilantes to try and keep order until a state government could be set up. And eventually more formal ways of governing appeared, and by 1864, Colorado, Dakota, which was still combined at that time, where was I? Oh yeah, Colorado, Dakota, Nevada, Idaho, Arizona, and Montana had all become official U.S. territories. Now remember, the Comstock Lode, that's 1859, so within 5 years you have 6 new official U.S. territories, which means that the government could come in and start setting up a government and bring in law enforcers. And with more stable governments in place, and with the rise of railroad transportation, which we'll talk about in just a minute, it would not be long before the West would be eventually permanently settled. And I can't talk about vigilantes without at least mentioning everybody's favorite vigilante. I'm Batman.
While farming drew people to the prairies and plains, mining beckoned them even further west. By horseback or rail, prospectors converged on the mountainous countryside, seeking their fortunes in silver and gold. Overnight, makeshift homes and tents would spring up along hillsides in the great wilderness. These settlements were the forerunners of cities such as Boise, Idaho, and Denver, Colorado. It was a rough and dangerous existence. Bandits roamed the roads, seeking the precious metal at the owner's expense. Vigilante law was established in many western towns where the rope and gun ruled. While mining made some rich, most prospectors managed only a meager living from the rapidly disappearing pockets of precious minerals.
So I mentioned in the previous section that it was the growth of mines as well as the growth of railroads that would eventually help the West to become permanently settled. So I want to backtrack a little bit as we start our discussion of railroads and just talk about roads in general. Are roads good or bad? And this is not an optical illusion that we're looking at. This is an actual house in the middle of a highway, or should I say a highway surrounding a house. So think about this. Are roads good or bad? Well, it really depends on your perspective. If you say that they're good, you're probably thinking about how easy it is to jump in a car with your family and run out to the mall or to pick up a pair of socks or run to the grocery store to get more bagels, anything like that. The ease that we have of transportation because our nation is so crisscrossed with so many roads. So if you're looking at the convenience aspect of it, roads are a good thing. But if you're this person and somebody decided to put a road through your backyard or through your house, what would you think of roads then? Would you think that the roads are good, or would you see it as a nuisance? Like I said, it really all depends on your perspective, whether roads or transportation alleyways are a good thing. Now, take this, what we've been talking about, roads, and now imagine that you are a miner living out in a very, very remote mining town. You are days or even weeks away from the next big settlement or civilization, so your main way to get supplies is not just jumping in your car and hopping on the turnpike. Your main way of getting supplies is the railroad. So to you, the railroads mean supplies, an easy way to ship your gold or silver back east or west, the only real way that you have to stay in touch and keep in contact with your family and your loved ones. So to you, railroads are a good thing. Now imagine, again, that you are a Native American living in Wyoming. You and your tribe are following a herd of buffalo like you've done for generations and generations, but now there are a series of wooden and metal tracks that go right through your hunting ground. And occasionally a large train, such as this one, would travel along this track at incredible speeds, frightening the buffalo herd. What then would you think of the railroads? It really depends on your perspective if the railroad is a blessing or if it is a curse. So how did the country come to be connected by this series of railroads? Well, at first, we've talked about this a lot, that at first most of the rail lines were back east, particularly in like the northeast part of the country. But in 1863, two companies began a race to build the first transcontinental railroad, or a railroad that would stretch across the continent completely. So you had two different companies that one started in the east, one started in the west, and they started building towards each other. So in Omaha, Nebraska, the Union Pacific Railroad started building and moving west, and the Central Pacific Railroad Company began in Sacramento, California, and started moving east. So you have the Union Pacific moving west, the Central Pacific moving east, and eventually the plan was that they would meet up and connect. And both companies received subsidies, and subsidies are financial aid or land grants from the government. So they were financially encouraged by the government to do this. And they received money, they received land grants, and 20 sections of land per mile of track in the states, and 40 sections per mile in the territories. So in already established states, they would receive 10 sections of land per mile that they completed of track. But in the territories, they received 40 sections of land. So they were really encouraged to make these railroads go through the territories because they were receiving more land in the territories than in the states. So in the end, both companies received over 45 million acres of land and just really ignored the Native Americans that already lived in these areas. And you can see in this map the railroads as well as the land grants around the railroad that were given to each of these companies. And then there was also eventually the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Northern Pacific, but right now we're talking Central Pacific and Union Pacific. Now remember, this starts in 1863, and what other major event is going on, and what are we right in the middle of in 1863? That's right, you guessed it. Yes, the Civil War. So that made working on the railroads very difficult and very dangerous. And plus, since the Civil War was still going on, it was also difficult to find men to work. So both of these companies relied very heavily on foreign workers to finish the job. And we're looking here at a picture of Chinese railroad workers. The Central Pacific brought in just thousands of workers from China, and the Union Pacific used Irish immigrants and Mexican Americans to try and finish their work. Both companies faced dangerous mountain ranges. You have the Sierra Nevada as well as the Rockies, and with that brought snowstorms, avalanches, and just the fact of trying to build a railroad through a mountain. But eventually, each side was able to break through. And on May 10th, 1869, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads met in Promontory, Utah, which we're looking at here. And you can see both trains had come and met each other right in the middle. And a solid gold spike was driven at the point where both railroads met. And this gold spike was later taken out because nobody wanted it to be stolen. And these two railroad companies coming together really symbolized the country, which now was united. The Civil War was over. We're in the middle of Reconstruction, and uniting these railroads became a symbol that the country was also now fully united. And large towns started to develop near where the rail lines met each other, where they met the cattle lines, but we'll talk about cattle lines in another section. And this rapid growth meant that more of these territories that were popping up could now start applying for statehood. And by 1890, Nevada, Colorado, North Dakota, and South Dakota, they had split from each other. Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, these were now all states. So that's a lot of states in not a lot of time. And our final video of the day is going to give an overview of how the Transcontinental Railroad not only affected the push westward, but also affected American industry, laws, economics, and life in general. And also, here's a picture of that gold spike I told you about, and it really does exist. It's on display in a museum in Utah. So there she is.
The generation between 1865 and 1895 was already mortgaged to the railways, and no one knew it better than the generation itself. Henry Adams.
To Americans in the 19th century, the perfection of the steam locomotive, the iron horse, meant everything. In the years after the Civil War, the railroads became the engine of the nation's industrial revolution and helped bring about the maturation of the modern national corporation. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Point, Utah, May 10, 1869, completing the Transcontinental Railroad, it was both the crowning moment of a national obsession comparable to putting a man on the moon, and the start of a new era, the era of big business. It all happened in one magical moment when the Union Pacific's number 119 locomotive, arriving from the east, met the West's Central Pacific Jupiter. The telegraph operator at the site typed,
"Alrighty now. The spike will be driven. The signal will be 3 dots for the commencement of the blows."
Around noon that day, a golden spike was driven by silver sledges, and the telegraph operator sent,
"Done."
With that, the nation erupted into celebration. The West was now permanently connected to the East. The idea of a transcontinental railroad began in 1836 with the development of the steam locomotive. The railroads grew steadily in importance up until the Civil War. Until then, they were in constant competition with canals as the primary means of transportation and communication east of the Mississippi. Though track construction was slowed during the Civil War, once over, railroad mania swept the nation. It is hard to overestimate what an economic force the railroads were. From 1865 to 1890, 123,000 miles of track were laid. This required staggering amounts of private money as well as guaranteed government loans and land grants. People were involved in surveying railroad right-of-ways, and the land had to be acquired. The actual construction of the railways employed thousands of workers. More men harvested timber for ties and for use in bridges and tunnels, while steel mills smelted iron ore and cast steel rails in millions of feet. The actual running of a railroad introduced new kinds of management. It involved acquiring and maintaining engines and train cars, constantly tending tracks, running train stations, maintaining records of commerce traveling over the routes, competing for market share and managing a complex legal and financial infrastructure unknown to the world only 10 years earlier. All of this held the opportunity for great risks of profit and loss. As the railroads expanded, a new kind of town appeared, the railroad town.
Every temporary terminus of track became a city. Wicked, wonderful, and short-lived. Canvas saloons, sheet iron hotels, and sod dwellings, surrounded by tin cans and scattered playing cards. Harper's Magazine.
Every town needed a railroad connection to survive. Some railroad boom towns grew to become major cities, and names like Tacoma, Cheyenne, and Albuquerque became powerful new trading centers. Older established cities like Chicago and St. Louis competed to become major railroad termini, producing huge railroad yards still in existence today. Cow towns formed where railroads intersected the famous cattle drive trails, such as the Chisholm Trail in Abilene, Kansas. From 1867 to 1880, hundreds of thousands of longhorns were rounded up in Texas and driven to the railheads in these cities for the markets back east. Ironically, railroads eventually replaced these cattle trails. The South benefited as much as the East and competed to lay its own intercontinental railroads through Texas and New Mexico to California. Farmers and cattlemen eventually came into conflict with the railroads, who used their power of control to drive up shipping prices. Because railroads crossed state lines, the federal government stepped in to regulate them. In 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. Today, the balancing act between the business of commercial transportation and the needs of the public for these services continues and can be seen in such regulations as used in airport security.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, there is no written assignment for today's lesson, but you will be responsible for this information along with some of the information from the textbook in the upcoming quiz. So, the impact that mining had on the West again, the cycle of boomtown to ghost town, and the impact of the Transcontinental Railroad and what it really meant to the country and the companies that were involved. All right, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you very, very soon.